Recording has started.
Everyone, we're going to start in just a few moments. We're giving those who are the last minute, wait till the last minute to log on to arrive. Okay. Bessa, do you want to open and then now that we're at 9:03, we'll get started?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, and welcome to all of our participants. It is a real pleasure to open this session of the future of think tanks and policy advice in Africa. My name is Vasu Gounden. I am the Executive Director of the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, and we're really proud to have been associated the last several years with the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program, the brainchild of Dr. Jim McCann, always energetic as ever, and made a huge contribution to the field in supporting think tanks across the world. Accord has been ranked for the last now 9 years in the top 100 think tanks. I think there are about 11,000 think tanks that are ranked globally on an annual basis. And last year on the global rankings, Accord was ranked number 1. So it's really a proud moment for us also to be co-hosting this event with the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program. So thank you very much, Jim, to you and your colleagues who've put a lot of effort. And let me at the outset also thank our colleagues at Accord who have assisted in putting this together. As I have said, for those of you who will soon read the document, in the opening lines of the chapter that was co-authored by myself and Dr. Cedric de Kooning, who will introduce this chapter, I said, paraphrasing Charles Dickens, that it would be appropriate to say about think tanks that it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. I think the best of times because today when we look at, and Dr. Jim McCann and I were chatting earlier on about this decade that is coming, which will be a decade of huge complexities and huge conflict. And it will require that think tanks step up to the fore and play their role in helping to shape the future, but also to solve the challenges of the future. And I think that's where it would be the best of times for think tanks, all of the new technology that exists that allows us to ensure that we present evidence-based research to inform policy making, to inform decision making. But it's also the worst of times because with fake news and with the fact that the space for think tanks is continuously being challenged by other entities, whether that is consulting companies, whether that is governments themselves, whether that is people who are just engaging in fake news and propaganda. And this places a huge challenge on think tanks as we move into the future. So this is an extremely timely study, and I think one that will help us as think tanks with all of the challenges, increasingly also the challenges that have come from COVID-19, where we have seen a record turnover among CEOs of think tanks across the world and funding challenges, etc., for think tanks. So this is a very, very timely book that will help all of us, and it's really, again, a pleasure to be associated with the think tanks and civil society programs, and it's my pleasure to hand over to you now, Jim, for your contribution to the opening session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vasu, and it is a great pleasure once again to work with you and your colleagues. If people could mute their mics because we're hearing your conversations in the background. Okay. Could you please mute your mics? And so once again, it's a pleasure to work with Accord and in terms of institutions across Africa. We clearly look for partners that in terms of both the institution, the staff reflect the diversity of the region in terms of both its programs, its mission, and its people. And Accord certainly is a leader in the region as a top think tank, but also as a model in terms of institutions within the region. I want to welcome everyone, and we must say, given the participants are from around the world, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And once again, would like to thank not only Vasu, but the staff who collaborated with us on the Africa Think Tank Summit. And Vasu and I were discussing, it was the last program we did. We squeezed it out at the very end of January, beginning of February of 2000, just before the COVID really broke. I want to thank the panelists who have joined us. Both Accord and TTCSP are both moving in a number of directions in terms of program, and I have been faced in the last month with interns who are the mainstay of the program who have transitioned on to bigger and better things. So there are a number of interns who are on this call who are the next 2 to 3 years, hopefully, who will be with me and help in terms of the programs going forward. This project, the future of think tanks and policy advice in Africa, as you know, I do work around the globe and work in all the major regions of the world. Africa has always been a particular priority for me because think tanks in Western Europe and in the United States and elsewhere are in a good position. Every think tank faces a challenge and a set of challenges that are common, and that's what we try to do in bringing the global think tank community together. But Africa faces a unique set of challenges, and we have been, with our colleagues in Africa, banging the drum in what is a real existential crisis for the region and for the think tanks in the region. And it is acute and more severe because the funding is not as stable, the staff are not as deep, and that there's significant turnover, and therefore they are more fragile as institutions. That, however, in the face of the reality that the needs in Africa, the challenges in Africa are significant, and my great fear, and what we have been trying to mobilize both policymakers, donors, both public and private, and the think tanks to strengthen their capacity to make donors aware of the need to strengthen not just the research programs, but the institutions themselves, so they will be there and ready and able to assist in the challenges and crises that the region will face, and the turbulence that Vasu has alluded to that will take place in the next decade. And they will be substantial. And my great fear and motivator is the fact that at precisely the moment we will need think tanks to help provide the advice and help lead the way out of crisis, that many will have vanished. And we are seeing that in the data we are collecting. A number of us at the first All Africa Think Tank Summit a number of years ago, both from Africa and the work that we were doing, predicted that 25% of the think tanks in Africa will disappear. As a result of COVID, we are seeing significant turbulence at the top, which is not a good sign generally. And for that, the urgency of what we have been doing about assuring the sustainability of African think tanks takes on a priority. And this meeting and this discussion, which we hope is lively and engaging and identifying the key challenges, and more importantly, the way forward, is key. The book project, which is a global effort and shows and demonstrates the commonality across regions, was driven by the fact that the challenge to evidence experts and think tanks by both technology and populist and other factors, and the need to essentially understand the dynamic that is taking place, but more importantly, to respond to it. And that is the driver in terms of the global discussion, which focuses on the impact of technology, the need for new strategies for fundraising, harnessing technology to enhance research and engagement, creating, which is a key aspect in terms of agile and more effective governance, and keeping up with technology in terms of social media and redefining or what is known as strategic communications, and rethinking how we communicate and disseminate our findings. So I will just provide a quick overview of the book, but the focus as discussed in the panels that will follow, just in case you did not receive the agenda, you can move to the next slide, is we will have I will give an overview of the book so you have the context, and then there will be a panel of those who contributed to the volume in the opening panel in terms of their essays, and then there will be three respondents, two or three respondents in the second panel, and then we will open it up for questions and comments from the audience, and then Vasu and I will just make some closing comments. And so this is just a quick overview of the book, or actually I should say books. It's 2 volumes. Next slide. This is what we do, and we are in the process of major in-depth studies in Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, China, Vietnam, India, and Korea. We are doing a deep dive in terms of analyzing the data, and we are reporting, and some of you have attended workshops on the state of think tanks in certain regions of the world, and then in particular countries, and I can share that information with you. Next. One of the things that Vasu and many of the people who are on the call is, and I'm fully committed to increasing the diversity, the inclusion of think tanks around the world, and particularly in Africa, in terms of the T20 and G20, more importantly, process. As a part of that, we have partnered with the host for the Italian T20, ISPI, in Milan, and we will be producing a program that's titled People, Planet, and Prosperity, which is a global forum, and I encourage, and we will be sending an invitation out to everyone, and I encourage you to participate. In meetings that we've had at the regional level, people have said, why should I'm not a G20 country, why should I be concerned? The agenda for the T20, especially in Africa and in developing countries, has profound and significant impact. Our goal at TTCSP and ISPI is to engage in a more effective and conscious way to engage as many of the 11,175 think tanks in the world in this process. And this meeting on June 22nd and 23rd is intended to do that, and I hope all of you will join us. Next. So here's the quick overview of the book. There are 2 volumes. One looks at it in the US, and then the second is global. There are 64 presidents who took the time out of their busy schedules to reflect on the strategic and operational and policy challenges facing think tanks. And we asked them to write a thought piece which became the content for the book and our discussion today. Next. These are a set of questions that we posed for the authors and may be the framework for our discussion. What are the greatest challenges facing think tanks, and in this context, in Africa? What is the value added? What do think tanks add in terms of value, and how effective have they been in helping the people and impacting policy in the countries where they are located? How should think tanks position themselves in the future? Many of the authors reflected on this. How have the recent innovations impacted think tanks, technological, and many of the authors revised, because we were in the process of producing the book before the pandemic, and then when it hit, in terms of when we sent it back to the authors for final editing and revisions, we said you can take this opportunity to comment on how COVID has impacted. So many of the authors have done that. How have new competitors transformed the marketplace of ideas? And key, historically, the main competitors for think tanks were those at the national, within the nation, and other think tanks. Competitors now are global and regional, and now law firms, consulting firms, and other institutions. So it is a global and much more competitive environment in an information-rich world. And then the final, which I've already mentioned, is the impact of COVID. Next. Just a quick sense of, and what I spend a lot of time on, is making sure that the list of institutions reflect that we've invited to write chapters are representative of the think tank landscape in a country or region, and that it has diversity, not only in terms of the issues, but also in terms of the opinions and perspectives they have in terms of research institutions. Next. It's a much larger, so we had to condense it, but here spent a lot of time making sure that every region was represented, and once again that a diverse set of think tanks had contributed to the process. Next. So here's the breakdown relative to the number of think tanks. So the Middle East and Africa have the smallest number of think tanks in the world, and the number in terms of those who are, in terms of the institutions are represented, are larger than the actual number of think tanks in the region. So we have not a perfect, but a good sample. And the intent was to, survey the global landscape and to see where there are commonalities and differences across the authors. Next. These are just some some comments, but what I mentioned in terms of the impact of technology, the impact of technology on both in terms of AI and big data, but also social media, and how that has transformed what think tanks do. It is no longer sufficient for think tanks to produce great ideas. In a crowded, information-rich world, think tanks need to be able to harness technology to increase their power of their research and also the reach of their research, and these comments reflect that. Next. And then here are, from the global edition. So as I said, there's a US and then a global edition, and we've just captured some of the key comments. I'll read Vasu, since it's here. The role of think tanks in Africa is likely to become even more important in the future, taking into account a number of significant challenges and opportunities, including on the policy side, population growth, urbanization, technological developments, the knowledge economy, and perhaps most significant, climate change. And then there are the operational challenges and strategic challenges that think tanks face themselves, which are reflected in many of the comments. Next. And so these are things that I've alluded to, so I won't go through them again, but the challenges and the need for think tanks to transform themselves. And the only thing I will say here is that I thought that AI technology would be the big disruptor of think tanks, and that's certainly true. I did not anticipate a global pandemic. And what the pandemic has done, for both good and ill, is intensified and accelerated changes that were already in play in advance of the pandemic. And the reality is that those who were moving to digitize their research, to be online and engaging online and using social media, were better positioned going into the crisis than those who had not started that. And the survival of think tanks may be determined by how they adapted, and certainly the key for now and the future, because there will be no new normal. There will only be a constant adapting to change and the abnormal. And those institutions that have agile management, etc., will be the ones that survive. Next slide. This is just an overview of think tank trends, so we'll skip so we can get on with the panel discussion. So this is the breakdown, and the only thing I will say here, this is from 2020, so the numbers have shifted, and the biggest change, which is reflected here, is that Asia has dramatically increased its number of think tanks, understanding from the West and just their own understanding of the need for think tanks, and there's been an explosive growth in the region. Next. These are just the illustrative list of the types of think tanks which we collect data on, and the in-depth analysis that we're doing of think tanks in every region are collecting data in 5 areas: data established, location, budget size, staff size, and the major areas of policy research that they're conducting. We welcome your contributing that information to us, and if you have any questions about that and would like to help and participate in these studies, I encourage you to contact me. Next. So the final thing, which I will not go through, we convened a number of groups during in town halls, and we convened. There were 5 groups: one on the economic impact, one of the public health impact of COVID, the social impact and how to respond, and the response that the international community should make. The final one was on how think tanks should respond, and there is a whole report and video of that session, which all of you may find of use and is on the TTCSP website. This just summarized, and I'll go through this quickly since I don't want to take the time to do it now, and many of these things will be covered. Next. Next. And so each one of these, which we will share with everyone, and will be posted on our website. What are the major recommendations coming out of the think tank and policy advice? So that gives you, and the intent was to create and give you a sense of what the book's about. I now turn it over to Vasu to chair the first session and to introduce the second, turn it over to the second chair, who is Cedric DeConing. Vasu?
Thank you very much, Jim, for that really great overview. I think now we're all eagerly awaiting the 2 publications, but certainly it's a very, very comprehensive assessment of think tanks across the world. Now, on this first panel, we will have 2 of the authors, Cedric DeConing from Accord and Rose Ngugi from the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. Let me quickly introduce. Cedric is a colleague from South Africa and has been with Accord from 1996, and we share him now also with the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs. So Cedric is a senior advisor and chief editor of Accord's COVID-19 Conflict and Resilience Monitor. He is also a researcher and professor in the Peace, Conflict and Development Research Group at the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, where he coordinates the effectiveness of Peace Operations Network, better known as EPON, and co-directs the NUPI Center for UN and Global Governance. Cedric has a PhD from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch here in South Africa. His recent publications include Insights from Complexity, Theory for Peace and Conflict Studies, adaptive peace building, which is something that Cedric came up with and that has now gained a lot of traction globally. And then understanding peace building as essentially local, and the BRICS and coexistence and alternative vision of a new world order. So it's really my pleasure. Cedric co-authored this article with myself, and I'm going to ask Cedric to take us through that article. Cedric, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Vasu and Jim and all the other colleagues who's with us in this session and who have contributed to the book. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you. So Vasu and I co-authored a chapter that looked specifically about the future of think tanks in Africa. And when we reflected on the role of civil society and especially think tanks in Africa, we realized that we really think about the role of think tanks in particular. We tend to think about non-governmental organizations and civil society more generally when we think about this kind of field in the African context. However, we think that think tanks play a very important role in the development and adaptation and enhancement of Africa's especially peace and security and governance and development spheres. And Accord has been particularly active, of course, in the peace and security and conflict resolution realm. And so we used that experience in particular to reflect on the future of think tanks. But these domains are, of course, all very, very closely interrelated. And when we consider the future of think tanks in the African context, one typical concern that I guess most people would imagine when we think about the space for think tanks is the degree to which there's a space for think tanks in an area, the peace and security area that we're focusing on, that one, of course, normally anticipate will be dominated by government. But we can really say that after now 29 years of experience of Accord in this field and in Africa, it's actually really been a problem for Accord. Governments and governmental multilateral institutions like the African Union are, of course, important stakeholders. And when it comes to the space in which think tanks operate, these are some of the main partners that think tanks engage with. And in our experience, most governments in Africa and institutions like the African Union and the regional economic communities in Africa that we have worked with are all keen to engage with ideas and solutions and are looking for partners that can deliver and are willing to experiment with new and innovative approaches to the challenges that they are struggling with themselves. And of course, many of or perhaps I guess all of the staff in these institutions, the officers, the diplomats that we work with, are of course people that have also been educated in the academic institutions in Africa and beyond, and therefore many of them have a degree of exposure and familiarity with some of the think tanks, or at least with the academic institutions that many of them are linked with. And of course, they are also on a daily basis engaged with the information that are being generated by these think tanks and research institutions. And of course, in the peace and security context that we focused on, these governmental institutions also study the specific conflict situations or regional conflict systems that they are trying to manage. And they look also, of course, when they need information about the emergence of rebel groups or insurgencies or violent extremism, they need to also study the ideas and norms and theories of change and processes and mechanisms that these institutions employ to prevent and manage and resolve conflicts. And in that process, think tanks are, of course, a very important resource for them, for the information and analysis that they need for their daily analysis and work that these governmental or multilateral institutions employ when they monitor trends or when they make specific decisions and judgments about how to manage particular situations. So this, of course, is not a situation that's unique to Africa. Accord also has experience with providing similar support to the United Nations or to the European Union and governments in other parts of the world. We came across the kind of question that people sometimes ask us, why do these institutions need this kind of support in relationship with think tanks? Is it an indication that there's a lack of capacity in these institutions? And especially in the African context, that question comes up. But in fact, of course, the countries and the institutions with the most capacity in the world, the largest economies, are also the ones who have the largest budgets for research and development, the ones who perhaps have the most extensive engagement with academic institutions and think tanks and research institutions. So a strong think tank sector and a strong engagement with think tanks is not at all an indication of necessarily a weakness in these institutions, but it is a case of burden sharing of knowledge generation and expertise. It will, of course, be costly and inefficient for many of these institutions to have all this kind of expertise in their institutions. It's much more convenient for them to be able to reach out and engage with this knowledge and expertise if and as and when needed. And we think it's for this reason as well that the role of think tanks in Africa is likely to become even more important in the future, taking into account the number of significant trends and changes that Jim has laid out so eloquently in his introduction. So I'll just conclude by saying that we think that in the chapter that we've contributed, that these challenges will provide new opportunities for think tanks to prove their value by providing quality evidence-based research, policy advice and support to governments and multilateral institutions. And of course, the more active role that they play that goes merely beyond providing research to one that actively works with governments to help turn policy and knowledge into policy and practice is, I think, what is needed, as Jim has also outlined in the beginning, to make sure that think tanks continue to play a very constructive role in the future of managing conflict on the African continent. Thank you very much, and back to you, Vasu.
Thank you very much, Cedric. I'm not going to comment on what you have presented, simply because I think we both contributed to it, and that's the joint contribution. But more importantly, we have two respondents in the next session, which you will be chairing, so they will respond to what you have presented. Let me now introduce our second contributor to the book. And I see Rose, I see you are there now. A pleasure to see you again. Dr. Rose Ngugi, who contributed a chapter in the book entitled Think Tanks in the Context of Africa's Development. She's the Executive Director of the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, known as KIPRA, and serves as the Secretary to the Board. She is involved in providing technical guidance and capacity building on policy and strategy formulation to the government of Kenya and other stakeholders, with the overall aim of contributing to the achievement of the national development goals of Kenya. She was a senior advisor in the Office of the Executive Director of Africa Group 1 of the International Monetary Fund, based in DC. Dr. Ngugi has been a member of the Central Bank of Kenya and on its Monetary Policy Committee, and has vast teaching experience in the University of Nairobi, particularly in the School of Economics. She is published widely. Research interests are wide in public policy, financial sector, investments, reforms, and on institutional issues. And she holds a PhD from the Business School of Birmingham. and the UK, and specializes in financial markets. And she has a master's and bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Nairobi, Kenya. Rose, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Faso. Nice to see you again. And nice to see everybody who is here, including our very good friend, James. I want to start by saying that the chapter that we contributed was teamwork. So I have also colleagues who did it, Dr. Moi and Mr. Mongera. But I also want to thank the think tank and civil society program for the engagement that it is doing with think tanks in the African region. It's actually providing a very good platform for networking and also for visibility of the think tanks in the region. So in thinking about the context within which think tanks operate in Africa development agenda, there are several things that I just wanted to point out that provide actually opportunities and also justifies the role that think tanks would play in supporting the policy process, providing evidence, and ensuring that the policymakers are well advised. One of the things is to realize that Africa, several things have happened in the last 2 decades. One is the formation of the African Union in 2002, which means that we have all the states, all the 55 states actually in one union, which to me is a very good effort that has actually borne one key element, that is the setup of the AU 2063 development agenda, which is a 50-year development agenda, and it gives a platform for transformation of the region, and all the evidence that can support that agenda is very, very crucial. Also, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was founded just recently, and it is now operational since this year. Again, policymakers will be looking at strategies and how best that each country can exploit the CFTA that the continent has come up with. In addition, we have various regional blocks. For example, SADC, East African Community, and the others. And what you find, for example, with East African Community is that they have also come up with a development blueprint, and they would be looking at evidence that can help in implementing the same. If one looks at the global perspective, is to say that we have not been left out by several shocks that have happened at the global level, whether we are talking about the recent pandemic shock, whether we are talking about the global financial crisis, but on our own also we have challenges with weather shocks, and all of us can remember in 2011 when we had the greatest drought in the Horn of Africa. And with all these things, development challenges have persisted. For example, we have poverty levels, and the issue of provision of adequate basic needs then finds its way in the Agenda 2063. We have the youth population, which is very, 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 very high, and policymakers are looking for strategic ways of harvesting the youth so that we can really yield the youth dividend for the region. Otherwise, it's an opportunity that we may lose. Infrastructure is investment is very needed for growth of private sector, so that you don't rely on the government for development. And debt issues, and especially now we are talking about the rising debt issues for low-income countries. And I have to say that for Africa, we have the highest number of low-income countries. So thinking about the Africa think tanks and what they really need to look at in terms of making themselves felt in the process. One of the things that we argue in that chapter is that it's important that we have an uptake of policy advice by the policymakers. So you can do all the research, you can do all the evidence, but if there is no uptake with the policymakers, then the advice may just remain like that, just an advice. The timeliness of such advices also becomes very crucial. That you don't provide evidence when the policymakers have moved on to put together the policy document, and that continuous generation of this evidence makes it easier for policymakers to have various options. A key element that could be a challenge includes the fact that skilled, seasoned researchers, such institutions are sometimes not able to keep them because the market also needs them, and given the funding, which is a bit low, then it makes it a bit difficult. But for some institutions, they have managed to get very good backing from the government, and I can say Kipra is one of them. And this sustains the institutions, and they can see the way forward. But of course, the need for more funding comes in, because in some cases you cannot grow the much you want to grow with the government funding. In addition, we point out the element of synergies, that we have so many of these institutions in the region, but they don't seem to have platforms where they can work together, where they can exchange views, such that there is not much duplication in their side. And for that reason, looking at a platform, for example, with the AU at country level, even with other institutions that bring together think tanks in the region, becomes very necessary for the think tanks to make a difference in the evidence-based policy-making process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. I think we have time for probably one or two questions before we move into the next session in 3 or 4 minutes. So let me ask if there's anybody who would like to raise any questions.
Yes, I have a question, a comment.
Yes.
Professor, go ahead. Professor Karuti.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me begin by saying appreciating all this work. It's a great work, and it's long since such work was done. I think way back in the 70s, that's when people think about the role of think tanks, and in particular research institutions. So congratulations to you and the team. Let me add my voice to this context in which think tanks operate in Africa, in addition to what Rose has.
And maybe, Professor, just give us your institutional affiliation also.
Oh, sorry. My name is Karute Kanyinga. I'm a professor at the Institute for Development Studies, University of Nairobi. I think we are the only Institute for Development Studies in Africa, or in the world, actually. Founded in 1965, actually through the RAND Corporation grant. The first director was James Coleman. You can see we have also James Coleman Foundation way back in the 60s. And we have the home of people like Joseph Stiglitz. Quite a number of Nobel laureates have passed through IDS. They used to be the top think tank in the 70s for many researchers from the West, especially Britain and the US. For different reasons, I think we've not remained at the top as we should have done. And that leads me to what's the context in which think tanks operate in Africa. In addition to what Rosa said, I would like to say that the more I look at it, the more I would like to say that the nature of government matters. It's not all governments across Africa that are able to say that we are following up ideas, this and that, and take it up for policy-making purposes. So that's an issue to start reflecting on. Many governments are keen to take up advice on issues to do with economic development, but when it comes to issues like government, political risks, and so on, they had better consult politicians rather than consult think tanks, and even rather than use data. I must admit that until fairly recently, other than the government of South Africa, until maybe 10 years ago, very few governments would collect governance data. Rose Goge will agree with me that even Kipra started collecting governance data, not when it was initiated in the 1990s. So, and it's simply because of those sensitivities that we must pay attention to. Related to this, I think is the whole question of the think tanks being drained by what Rose Goge has called ability of very good performing researchers being targeted by other market groups. Sorry, there's some disturbance. Sorry, there is what we can call internal brain drain, not from one institution to another, but internal brain drain by the consultancy industry, especially by multinational, bilateral, and multilateral agencies, the World Banks of this world, the bilaterals of this world, looking for the best in the universities, for the best in autonomous institutions like Kipra, and using them for consultancy purposes, but whose data is not shared even in a platform on which we are. I think that's an issue we may want to start thinking about. How do we ensure greater collaboration with this new consulting business that is draining think tanks in many ways. The last 100 point, I think Ross has raised it in a very fundamental way, and Cedric in South Africa, I think, has also raised it, the uptake by government. How you package your research findings, the timeliness of it matters. But I would like also to say whom you package it for is very important, and the space you use for that uptake matters, because it's not every space that matters. There are many government officials who would like to have a very silent conversation on any data, not public data. So choosing when and how to do it. There are some who like publicity, there are some who don't like publicity. There are some who say that bring those research findings and we discuss in silence so that we can have better uptake. My last point is partnerships between West and Africa. For lack of a better word, let me not say that that partnership has not been great. And if I can say this, I'm a very free person. Let me say that the notion of equal partnership sometimes is eroded by how we relate with one another. I mean, using up senior researchers in Africa as research assistants, it's not good. You know, pick any journal that you have on your desk and look at anything written on Africa and ask yourself, how many African scholars are cited in that journal? Just pick one, even right now, even at the back of your. I mean, if you look at British scholars, they quote a lot. They cite African scholars, but that's not true of American think tanks. You know. I'm sorry to use that word. I know I'm stepping on a very bad territory, but there is that inequality that actually doesn't bode very well for partnership, even as we think about how to move into the future. And finally, that's the final point I will make. I spoke about the bilaterals and the civil society groups throughout the continent. They take a lot. There is a lot of uptake by them of research work. A lot of uptake by private sector, but it's not structured in a manner we can say it's predictable that they will take up this, because there hasn't been systemic linkages between the private sector and the think tanks in Africa, except public bodies like Kipra and probably ourselves. So systematic linkages will be required even as we think about moving forward. Fostering stop relationship, fostering strong partnership is the way to go if we want to avoid this. Otherwise, I'm one person convinced that funding is not the problem. Sorry.
No, thank you very much, Professor. You made some very key points in responding to both the speakers. We're running out of time. I don't know, Cedric, do you have a 30-second response before I give Rose a 30-second response?
Not really. I think Professor Karuti made a lot of very important points, and of course, as he mentioned as well, it differs a lot between the sectors and the different areas we work with. And while I certainly recognize many of the points raised, in many of those areas, our experience at Accord has been slightly different, perhaps partly because we've been working specifically in the peace and security sector, very often with the African Union or regional economic communities in partnership and in support of those initiatives. So not all of our experiences have been the same, but I recognize that that is not true for all sectors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Cedric. Rose, do you have a 30-second comment?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's just to say that I feel very strongly that think tanks in Africa can actually build up their synergies, having platforms where they can actually engage with the policymakers. For example, in Kenya, we have tried to bring together think tanks in the country. Of course, we are still at the very beginning. And this can also go to the continental level. For example, we have collaborated with the ACBF in putting together the conference for the summit for the think tanks in the region. And I also like the fact that the think tank and civil society program is also coming in actually to provide that kind of platform. So these platforms are necessary for think tanks also to learn what are the expectations of the policymakers, and policymakers also to give their view as far as what they look for is concerned from the think tanks. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Rose. Thank you. Sorry, Jim, go ahead.
You have time to take another question if you'd like.
Okay, great. Do we have another question?
From the audience?
Catherine, are there any questions? I think not at this point. So okay. We will now have regional and global perspectives. Cedric will chair the session. I think Dr. Najat from Morocco, unfortunately, could not make it. So, Cedric, for your purposes, let me hand over to you, Cedric. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vasu and colleagues, for the first session. As you mentioned, in this second session, we now have two respondents or comments or perspectives from Professor Marlos Lima and from Rama Yade. I hope I pronounce your names correctly. And we're going to start with Professor Lima. Professor Lima is the Director for International Affairs at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. He's also an economist at the Brazilian School of Economics and a founder member of the Latin American Group for Public Administration. And he is involved in various other international public administration related initiatives as well. So Marlos, can I give you the microphone for the next 7 or so minutes? Thank you. Over to you, Marlos.
Yes. Thank you, Cedric. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Vasu. I really appreciate the opportunity to hear such an important group of think tanks represented. Above all, learning from your experience is extremely useful, captivating, of course. Well, I must say that the future of think tanks is not an easy one, though it can be fulfilling. Come from FGV, a think tank located in Brazil, at the Global South. I think it helps me to understand and emphasize with most of the issues and challenges that have been discussed here today. The overall disruption caused by the COVID crisis only reaffirms the need for think tanks to be ready to adapt. especially consider the long-term duration of the crisis in the global south compared to US, compared to Europe, and to a few Asian nations. Well, as it is used to be said, the future is not about building back better, but about moving forward differently. In short terms, think tanks will need to deal with some challenges, according to my point of view, which is a Latin American point of view. These challenges have been discussed in my article with Carlos Ivan Simons Leal, the president of FTVG, on the book The Future of Think Tanks and Policy Advice Around the World, organized by Dr. McGann, issued earlier this year. The first challenge, of course, is the financial sustainability. The pandemic had a strong impact on financial health of think tanks, of course, and the situation is critical. The contraction of local economics hit donors, and funding from institutional research partners is at risk, since private companies and governments suffer the consequences of the depression of the recession. Well, at the same time, competition increased, as Jim said, and the small and large consulting companies alongside media diversify their products and their services. It is time to review expandery, not related to analytical research, communication findings, or policy analysis. Investment in innovation will help these areas to improve. For example, digitalization may provide substantial operation gains, and fundraising efforts will also have to increase. To do this requires a deeper connection to communities and more robust compliance policies. This is particularly important when you consider to deal with private sector compliance policies. The second challenge is something that has a lot to do with Latin American environment. It's about how to influence policy. How do think tanks keep the capacity to impact policy in times of skepticism towards science? Political polarization is a threat to think tanks' ability to influence policy choices. It removes rationality out of the public debate. It affects think tanks' credibility, since opportunism dominates public debate. At the same time, policymakers increasingly consider evidence-based research non-essential when proposing policy solutions to complex problems. As part of this phenomenon, traditional approaches to influencing policymakers may no longer work. It is now necessary to think tanks to think of new ways of reaching decision makers. To do this, it is necessary to move into spaces where the public are, the spaces the public occupies, as social media, podcasts, and why not even TV. Think tanks must take their research into cell phones and laptops, on the move, as well as in the library. Third challenge will be, and this is particularly important in Brazil, maintaining a long-term focus. Complex issues are hardly diagnosed in a short time frame. However, society currently lacks the patience needed to allow research to mature, and daily issues tend to pull experts and resources out of long-term research on structural problems. Focus on today's crisis constantly overtakes planning. It is a short-term trap for think tanks. We will need to count on our leadership's abilities to navigate short-term demands and at the same time sustain long-term research programs. It's not a matter of only responding to present challenges, but mainly to drive tomorrow's decisions and moving forward. Fourth and last challenge I would point out is innovation. We all know that innovation is key to the survival of think tanks. Innovation is searching for new revenue sources. Innovation is engaging with society and influencing policymakers. And innovation to maintain a focus on long-term research while dealing with short-term opportunities. Investing in technology means operating through the cloud, using artificial intelligence, using multidisciplinary research, and communicating with the adequate tools and your target audience to make an impact. Think tanks need to become more comfortable with these concepts. Finally, we live in times of growing asymmetries and inequalities between countries, companies, and people. We believe that our main goal as think tanks representatives must be to show people that the product of our work is able to positively impact their lives. On the contrary, we will work and talk in vain. That's what I think. Thank you very much.
Very much, Prof. Lima. And I believe Ambassador Ramayade has not been able to join us yet, but Jim, that you were going to stand in, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I can, from a global perspective, one of the things that I would say clearly and reiterate what I mentioned earlier, that and what Marlos has echoed, is that the challenges that all think tanks face are similar. I would think that virtually every think tank from Africa would echo what he said as a challenge they face. I think, however, it's important, and especially in this context, that we distinguish why the problems in Africa, the challenges in Africa, are much greater. And how do we, as a global community of think tanks, support and help sustain the think tanks community throughout Africa? Clearly, as I mentioned, and has been by the professor and by Marlos and others, clearly the issues of the volatility or turnover in terms of staff, the fact that the institutions have very small benches, meaning that they don't have, relative to other regions, large staffs, and that there is a turnover in those staffs. That funding, since outside of Western Europe and North America, the lion's share of the funding that comes for think tanks in other regions of the world is principally from government and public and private international donors, which has its own set of constraints. And then finally, what has become what I would describe are two additional points. One, a perfect storm in terms of funding. One, that the significant commitment that Hewlett and Gates administered by IRDC in supporting think tanks has ended. And there were, and I had advised from the very beginning in terms of the strategy, there were several things that I advised against, and in terms of what not to do. And I will, make some remarks on that. The second is at the same time, and this is why it's a perfect storm, the World Bank, which had a significant effort in terms of capacity building of think tanks in Africa in order to support the institutions themselves, the countries themselves, but also the work of the World Bank, has been greatly diminished and, may, or, depending on your perspective, ended. And then simultaneously, the Nordic countries, which for many years have been generous, and Cedric, you may comment on this, have shifted in terms of priorities to the humanitarian crisis, not necessarily in Africa, but in other regions. That has exacerbated the situation in terms of think tanks in Africa and presented a whole set of unique staffing, funding challenges for the institution. And then the funding that has been provided and referenced in Marlos's comments is the fact that there has been generally a focus on short-term project-specific research as opposed to supporting the institutions. And one of the challenges in terms of from the generosity of Gates and Hewlett was a focus on evidence-based research, which in the era that we're in, no one would argue with, but not in sufficient understanding and focus on the sustainability in terms of how do you improve the overall framework of the institution and project-specific funding and evidence-based refunding. And I have worked with a number of think tanks in Africa. What had happened with that is that the focus was on individual, successful, well-known scholars within an institution who received substantial funding for their programs. They grew. But the overall infrastructure, and I mean both human and physical infrastructure and funding, became problematic, to say the least, in terms of, and created in terms of its own sustainability crisis. One, the perfect storm, and then the nature of the funding, rather than strengthening key institutions, and I've worked with a number that were the premier institutions, and what happened is that each, there was funding for evidence-based research for key funders, for key scholars and their program, but not the institution. And the problem is that the exit of both Hewlett and Gates and others has essentially had a dramatic and negative impact, and the collapse of not only the research they supported, but the larger institution. And so these are the realities that think tanks in Africa face. And then I think the other part, which is what we as a community globally, could you remind people to mute their mics?
Please
I'll just
mute your mics. I think, Paul, your mic is on, and maybe Diego, if you could please mute your microphones. Thank you. Back to you, John.
And I think in the effort in convening groups of think tanks from Africa, and in this group and beyond, because it is for all of us an issue and a challenge that we must together face, is to essentially, and most importantly from Africa, and Rose and others, and the professor from Kenya has also alluded to this, is that as a community, we must not, take what is defined for us as the needs of think tanks in the region, but as a community collectively communicate both the challenges we face and what is required to sustain the institutions, and to bang that drum as loudly as possible and as a group. I have the great fear that the sustainability crisis will grow, and that the major donors, both public and private, have sort of said, we did our bit and we're moving on. And we will pay a price for that attitude. And there is not there, and we need to fill that gap, because the need is great, and it is not only in the interest of the community of think tanks, but it is in the interest of the world community to have, as Vasu has mentioned and others, that there is a great crisis on the horizon. And places like Latin America and Africa, there will not only be challenges that we have already seen, but major social challenges in terms of and political disruptions and social movements that will be highly problematic. And so it is in all of our interest to meet that, and that we need to do it together and make specific, tell donors what are the things that we need to strengthen and sustain our institution. So Cedric, back to you.
Thank you very much for all those reflections, highlighting especially the various challenges we face. Can I just ask
we need to, I think, remind people, because you're being drowned out by those who still have their mics on. Please mute your mics.
Yeah. Paul Karaoke, if you can hear us, please mute your microphone. And also, please, everyone, check if your microphones are muted.
Maybe, Cedric, just turn your volume slightly up.
My volume?
Yeah, it was a little low.
Okay. Well, let me talk a little bit louder and see if that works. Maybe I'll just increase my own volume. So I just need to check also how many minutes we have left in this particular session. We can get some feedback on that. But I open the floor to anybody who would like to contribute to the conversation, who would like to ask a question. I noticed in the chat we have 2 questions from Saeed Mufti that I think is also very relevant and that has been touched on. One also relates to the human resources issue and asks about how can we manage to make sure that we attract good quality personnel in our think tanks, taking into account the financial constraints. And this is something certainly at Accord we've also noticed the turnover that the other colleagues have also referred to. Many people who have passed through Accord are now working at the African Union or the United Nations or in government. So at least it's good for the network, but it does mean that we have to constantly train a new batch of people. And that's maybe part of the service that I think we provide as think tanks. And then the second question that Saeed is posed, I think is an important question that we haven't really touched on so far in today's session. And that is how do we ensure that the research and the knowledge that we generate are objective, taking into account the sources of funding and the direction of our work that those sources of funding often ensure or bring about. So if anybody would like to respond to Saeed's question, or if you have a question of your own, please go ahead.
Well, I think it clearly is an issue, and I think the added dimension that Saeed has added that we need to address. It's not. I mean, one, I would start with that there are very dedicated, very capable people working at think tanks throughout Africa. The challenge is not to further or increase the recruitment because we don't have good people. There are good people. And what Saeed has mentioned, which is the other challenge, is how do we keep the good people we have? I mean, it's not just recruitment, it's retention. And others have mentioned the problem in terms of the best scholars become known and identified, and then the multilaterals essentially who have attractive offers and who would refuse them, are able to attract the best and brightest from all of the institutions. And in some respect, that's a good thing because it shows impact, but at the same time, it doesn't help the institutions themselves. And so, once again, these are sort of specific recommendations that as a community, we should figure out what are the major challenges and what are the interventions. Part of it's pipeline, but having people is one thing, but also retaining them is the other. And how do we do that and make the work and the opportunities and the funding available to enable institutions to retain good people. I don't know if Marlo's or
Cedric, you're muted.
Sorry, Marlos, I don't know if I was asking if you want to come in on this particular issue. And I wanted to ask you, Marlos, as well. You mentioned also in your intervention the issue of the competition with consulting and other forms of institutions that provide similar services sometimes to think tanks. And if you have a particular advice to think tanks in Latin America, in Africa, about how to respond and deal with that challenge. Have we lost Marlos? And if Marlos is not with us, is there anybody else who would like to take the floor? I see Maria Rita Furtado has a question. Maria, do you want to take the floor, or would you like me to read it out? So I see in the question in the chat, Maria asks and refers to the presentation that Professor Lima that Marlos made about the success and further development of think tanks and how that relies on technological innovation. And she asks, she was wondering if he could expand on that, and is it that technology in terms of data collection or better online platforms and presence? And it's also a question that came to me in terms of the potential digital gap that may widen between, for instance, Europe, North America, China, Japan, and Africa and Latin America. So also, if Marlos is not with us, Vasu, Jim, or others, if you have a comment to Maria's question, please go ahead.
Well, clearly the gap is going to widen, and clearly it is. This is an area where making specific recommendations from the community of the needs and how do things that we've discussed in the Africa summits in the past. How do you one of the challenges is that all think tanks need to be smarter, better, faster, more agile, more digital. And clearly for those institutions where the resources, both financial and human, are constrained, how do you do that? How can you expect us to do that? And what we're looking at is how do you do it on the cheap? In terms of the communications with a cell phone these days, you can produce pretty sophisticated podcasts, etc., and help facilitate the dissemination on the cheap. But not everyone knows how to do that, and the question is, sharing that, and also, places like Microsoft, etc., who talk about the digital divide. The think tank communities play an instrumental role, and they should be, asked, to essentially provide the resources and the training to help build the capacity in think tanks in Africa and provide free of charge the resources, which is if they're committed to Africa, as Gates and Microsoft appear to be, to essentially provide this small investment to dramatically enhance the reach of think tanks, and focusing on what are the things, and the evidence-based problem is that it focuses on the research but not on how to communicate in terms of both impact and also in terms of fundraising. And so these things are all interrelated, and there needs to be an academy that helps train and strengthen the institutions, and once again the needs and the specific needs and things that you've alluded to need to be communicated, because there's power in the common voice in making those requests for funding and for resources. So
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much.
Marlos is back, I see.
Yes, and I recognize Professor Karuti as well wants to come in, but let me just first check with Marlos. Marlos, I think we lost you there for a moment. Did you want to respond to Saeed's question? And there was also a question from Maria specifically directed to you in the chat that's focusing on the role of technology that you mentioned earlier.
Sorry, I've been facing technical problems here and trying to come back, and it has not been easy. Could you please repeat the question for me, please?
Okay, so I think two of the things that would be really interesting to get your opinion on is one, Maria in the chat is referring to the comments you made about the role of technological innovation and the importance of that for think tanks. And she's wondering if you could expand further on what you think are the key issues think tanks the challenges they need to overcome or need to focus on when it comes to technological innovation.
Sure.
Maybe let me stop with that one.
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. The issue about technological innovation is the following: we are in the business of influence, of convince people to do what we think would be better for the country or better for the world. Now, new technologies have arrived, such artificial intelligence, such as deep diving, and those tools of analysis have been used mainly and broadly by all social sciences. So a think tank analysis today cannot be more only based on the traditional analysis we've been doing for the last decades. New technologies have arrived where we have at FGV, we have been investing a great amount of our budget on artificial intelligence. And I think that will be the future for the think tanks in order to be able to deal with the complexity of the environment we are living in. It's absolutely fundamental.
Thank you very much, Marlos. Let me turn to Professor Karuti, who indicated he also has a comment on Maria's question. Professor Karuti.
Thank you much. I think Marlos has responded in a very neat way on the question of technology, because yes, we are in the business of influencing, but also influencing goes with how we package what we want people to believe in, and I think that's where technology comes in. The fortunate thing is that COVID-19 has had a lot of opportunities for us in Africa in terms of helping us to leverage on the technology we have to reach people we wouldn't have reached, to touch places and that we wouldn't have touched in the past. And I would say that there is a movement of believers now in think tanks, if one can say that. But the only problem, and this is what we may want to underline, is competition between subjectivity and objectivity. You mentioned very early from the very beginning that a major challenge for think tanks today is false news, for instance. False data accompanies most of the things that are done today, because everybody wants to look for an opportunity to convince someone else in sometimes very negative ways. And therefore, how to create the basis for credible and objective data and the dissemination of that same data in a very scientific manner remains a challenge for all of us, because sometimes false news is packaged in such a neat manner that you'd have very difficult ways of convincing an ordinary citizen in the streets that this is actually false news, this is rumor. It's packaged in a different way. And this leaves us to think very hard about how do we use technology to reach more people with objectivity? How do we use technology to undermine subjectivity with credible and objective data that cannot be reduced to anything else? And I think this must be a challenge for all of us, that we must think about how to cross that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Karuti. And I see Vasu's got his hand up, and I also wanted to ask Vasu a question about this, because I know that As we were all being disrupted by COVID-19, Accord made a particular investment in use of technology to stay in touch with its network. So maybe that's something you can reflect on as well, Vasu, in addition to what the point you wanted to raise. Over to you.
Yeah, no, Cedric, I think, Malos, you made two comments. The first was you said it's not about building back better, but rather moving forward differently. I thought that was a very profound comment. And then the second thing you talked about was innovation. And I think the key challenge, if I just look now, putting all of this together, the key challenge for us as think tanks is, do we ride the wave or do we swim against the tide? And I mean, that's really where we are now. And what Cedric was alluding to is Accord. I think we decided to ride the wave. We saw this wave coming, and COVID-19 presented a huge challenge to our institution, because a lot of our work involved, traveling around the world, around Africa, mediating, holding seminars, trainings, policy discussions, etc. And suddenly, they grounded all the air flights, shut the borders, and here we were sitting, and we had to think very fast, what do we do? Because, technically, we could not work. And we immediately set up some task teams, 5 task teams, and out of that came the publication that Cedric and Senzo and Gubana in the office co-edit, which is the COVID-19 Conflict and Resilience Monitor. Today it's an extremely popular publication. It's widely read by policy and decision makers. It's become one of the sought after publications on a weekly basis by decision makers, simply because of the depth and breadth that it covers, but also the fact that what we've done as Accord is we've traded on our 29-year network across the continent, right at the highest level, all the way down, and we brought all of these people as authors into the monitor. So I think as much as COVID-19 presented us with huge challenges as a community, it's also given us huge opportunities. So riding the wave is basically saying, well, things have changed. We cannot buy all these skills in. We cannot maintain these big offices. We can't sustain ourselves. And yet there's so much value in having a community of people in an office, sharing on a daily basis, working and educating each other, etc. But that's become so challenged. So what we have done over the last year is we've been building what we are calling a networked institution. And we've done extremely well. We have networks of researchers, networks of mediators, networks of peace builders, and it's working for us as an institution. We're now at the point where we're looking at the physical premises that we have, and we're saying, what does the physical premises actually mean in the context of this new environment? And, the fact that, here there are 52 people who would never be able to get together in such a discussion, but here we are, 52 people on this platform sharing and listening to each other. So that's opened up a completely new world. And then, we decided that we will invest now heavily in artificial intelligence, other technologies, and to build a full-blown data analytics unit, because big data is where it's going. So ride the wave, and see how we go there and bring the best brains in Africa and globally to work with us. And I think that's really where we're going. We've got a task team looking at the data analytics side, a task team looking at partnerships. So, I think exactly what you said, building or moving forward differently and innovating. And that's exactly what we have done. And, we'll be very happy in the network to share our experiences with others, to look at what are the challenges we are experiencing, but what are the vast opportunities that are out there that, we are grasping and moving forward.
Thank you very much, Vasu. And I think what you are referring to in this context of network organization is perhaps also partly a means of managing the human resources question we discussed earlier. Because people will move and for various reasons work in different institutions and places, but through this networks that we establish, there's still a way of tapping into that knowledge and engaging a large set of expertise in different institutions. So I think that's certainly an option. Jim, I think we need to hand back soon to you, but I think there's a few more minutes before we do. And I noticed that Raphael also posed a question in the chat, and if anyone else would like to ask a question or pose a question in the chat, please do so. And Raphael asks, why do governments choose to consult consultancy firms or individuals whilst ignoring existing think tanks or research institutions? Is it an issue of lack of capacity of existing think tank institutions or political interests? And I wonder if Rose perhaps have a comment on that, or anyone else, of course, is welcome as well. I recognize Jim, but let me just first check if Rose maybe would like to take the floor on this question. Don't think, Rose, if you are talking, you just need to unmute. Okay, let's go to Jim. Thank you.
Sorry, could you repeat the question,
yes.
please? Yeah.
Sorry, Rose.
You need to repeat the question.
Okay. I was saying that I see in the chat that Raphael was asking about why governments would choose consultancy firms over think tanks. Oh. Is it because there's a lack of capacity in the existing think tanks, or do you think there's other reasons? What is your experience?
Yeah, our experience is that some of the consultancy firms that the government goes to, they are very well established. They've been in existence for a long time, and they have sort of built a niche. And with that niche, then the government tends to go to them for very specific elements. But secondly, is that for some other kind of consultancies, sometimes assume you have just a think tank like Kipra. It's very difficult for each to do everything, which means that you still need other arms to work together. And it's for that reason that it makes it maybe important that some of these consultancies are also like think tanks. Bring them together. Let us all work together, synergizing one another and understanding that when we work as a team, we are able to give the best to the government. Yeah, that's how I would respond to that question. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rose. Jim, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I think that Rose has, very well articulated the challenge. There are a few other things. I mean, one is, the consulting firms have a competitive advantage, which is something that we should look at closely, and as a community, and because they, essentially have developed the niche, but they have also developed, how to generate a response to RFPs and contracts quickly. They have that capacity and the accounting, and so governments like the ease of that, where it can be at times cumbersome with think tanks. But I think that, and the other key two factors that need to be addressed is that think tanks have not effectively communicated what they can do for government. And, I think that's not just in Africa, that's globally. And then I think the case, especially in Africa, because the use of consultants and large consulting firms is way out of bounds in terms of the number, and that the case, once again, as a community, needs to be made. Why are you overlooking indigenous capacity? Why are you overlooking institutions within the country that are not either partnering with or even considered outright because they have the capacity? Kipra and others, here on this call certainly have the capacity to do it, and government has in certain times looked to them, but as a general case, do not look to think tanks. And the indigenous part and case is, why are you using international organizations or consultants for this when you should be supporting the institutions in your country? I think that's a part of the case of what think tanks can do and why the countries should and governments should use think tanks.
Thank you very much, Jim. And I mean, the thought just comes to my mind as well, as when you, in response or stimulated by what Rose and you said, that I think maybe partly the very often the consulting firms offer a kind of a technocratic solution that is attractive, whereas some of the larger challenges, paradigm shifts, or inherent inequalities and so on that think tanks may point out is so much more difficult to address. And so sometimes the think tanks maybe put their finger on the real problem, but the governments would prefer to get the technocratic solution that makes them feel that they're doing something about it. So that may also be a dimension.
Yeah, Cedric, two additional things which follows on that. One is that there may be the perception which has to change that the advice that is provided by think tanks is too academic and not technocratic enough. And then I think what has not been mentioned, which is a big factor, is it's easy in terms of justifying and for cover in terms of government officials to use a big globally named brand consulting firm to sort of, if the program goes south, they can say, well, this is a world-renowned thing. What do you, wasn't my fault. And so that, that's part of the inclination is the reputation, etc.
I think that's an important point. I think according to our schedule, I should now hand back to Vasu and to Jim for wrapping us up and concluding in the last few minutes. So let me hand back to you. Thank you very much to Marlos and for Jim also for stepping in and for all your questions and for your interesting discussions. Thank you very much. Back to you, Jim and Vasu.
I think we have a few minutes if there are any final questions, and then Vasu and I will sort of close the program. We allotted a sufficient amount of time, but we do not have to take the whole time allotted. Are there any last minute from either from the continent or beyond that people would like to make quickly, short interventions or questions?
Yeah, maybe I can make a word on consultancy firms, the question asked by Rafael. I think we must acknowledge that sometimes think tanks are not very self-censored as consultancy firms are. Many consultancy firms are there for profit and therefore will be very concerned about how they say things and what they tell government. Think tanks are there sometimes focused on what the society should look like and how to look like, and therefore will not care about how they package their words and what they say. And therefore, government will always tend to go to listen to whoever will tell them bad things in a nice language.
Right. The emperor never wants to be told that he has no clothes.
Yes.
All right. If there are no further questions or comments, Vasu, I would just say, and then, as the host, the final word, that what all of this raises is the need for new business model and rethinking what think tanks are, how they operate, and what are the skill set of all of the key people at the institution, both in terms of that now the complexity of the organizations and the challenges that it face requires, a seasoned manager to manage a complex organization who also has to be a policy or social entrepreneur, because in order to keep the organization going, that there has to be a tech dimension to the institution, and in terms of communication, so that research will remain a central part of it, but it isn't the only part. and that all of those pieces, which I think in terms of the nature of think tanks and the coming from the academic model, those things were not priorities. But the world that we live in, the world that is transformed, requires a new business model, a new approach to what think tanks are and how they do what they do, in order to continue and to sustain what is a very important function for all of our countries. And we need to come together as a community to help push that forward and to help all of our colleagues meet the challenges that lie ahead. So Vasu, I turn it over to you. I want to thank all of you for coming, and all of you that have participated. It's been a wonderful discussion in highlighting some of the key challenges that we face. But I would close by saying we, send to us, because we're doing a report on Africa. What are the challenges, but what are the things that are needed that we can include in the recommendation section of the report to help push some of these things forward. Thanks to all of you. Vasu?
Thanks, Jim. Let me start firstly by thanking you, Jim, and the Think Tanks and Civil Society program. You have this wonderful byline for TTCSP, the Think Tanks think tank. And I think, that's really a wonderful way to capture what you do. And when we talk about a community of solidarity, you've managed to pull all of this together and pull all of us together. So thank you very much, and thank you to your team. Let me thank the team at Accord, Senzo and Catherine, who's sitting opposite me, for really the hard work in pulling all of this together. And then maybe, Jim, you and I spent too much time together because I made some concluding remarks, and they've exactly the same points that you were making. I think, firstly, what is our value add as think tanks? We need to work that out. We need to really understand in each of our different, categories of think tanks, what is the value add that we bring? The second question, I think, is how do we restructure? Because we have to restructure. This is a new environment, and it calls for restructuring of our institutions. The third question is the one you raised also. What is the business model? We've had to do this in Accord. Model. Where, the business model is different from a profit model. And so we need to think about a business model for sustainability, as opposed to a business model for profit. And then, the last question for me would be something that Professor Karuti raised about equality is, how do we flatten the globe? And so that, no north, south and all of that. How do we just flatten the globe and we build a community of equality across the world with all think tanks? And I think there, Jim, the TDCSP has such an important role to play in flattening the globe. So thank you very much. Thank you for the partnership, the ongoing partnership. Thank you all for your participation. And we hope to see you soon in the range of things that TDCSP has been doing and Jim has circulated to everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you all. Have a great day or evening or sleep, depending where you are.
Exactly. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.